It's our great pleasure to have you today with us. So the floor is yours. Please, thank you once again.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for having me today, you guys. It's truly a pleasure and a privilege to be with you this morning. And I hope all of you are keeping sane and staying healthy during these tumultuous times. Again, thanks very much for joining today. As Dr. Lamiran said, today's topic is basically a brief tour de force of American foreign policy, going back to the early days of the American Republic. And of course, it is impossible to cover the entire topic of US foreign policy, such a complex and extensive topic in such a short amount of time. But, and obviously I'll be skipping lots of events, lots of topics, but want to give you just a brief general idea of what US foreign policy is and how we got here today. Again, the topic of today's discussion is the American foreign policy and evolving world strategy principles and the Asian pivot. I'll try to talk about 30-40 minutes. If you guys have any questions, just write it down, and towards the end we'll have maybe 15-20 minutes question and answer session. I'm happy to answer any questions you guys might have. That being said, let's get started. And before I do that, can everyone see the PowerPoint that I'm sharing? Can everyone see it?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. Let's get started then. So what the US map tells us, it is practically impossible to have an idea about American foreign policy, or of any country for that matter, without looking at the map of a certain country. Maps tells us a lot about the behavior, about the history, about the perception of a certain country when it comes to foreign policy. So take a look at the United States map. It's a continent-sized country stretching from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to Pacific Ocean, not counting the states of Alaska and Hawaii. The original first 13 colonies originating in the East Coast, close to the Atlantic Ocean, the expansion took decades, stretching all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So in 1860, the American Census Bureau basically declared that the American frontier had been closed, inviting that the United States was now free to basically replace the borders with global frontiers, meaning the United States had closed its borders. It was time to basically expand outwards. And the two great strategic assets that the United States has, it's obviously the two oceans, Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, that geographically isolate the United States from the troubles of Europe, the troubles of Asia, the troubles of Eurasia as a whole. While isolated geographically, at the meantime, United States is very much connected to the rest of the world by the awesome river systems that it has. Again, while Pacific and Atlantic Oceans isolate the United States from the rest of the world, the United States has more navigable rivers than the entire world combined. So for instance, during the first decades of the American expansions, traders, merchants could use Ohio River to sail all the way from the state of Ohio to the Caribbean basin and eventually go throughout the world. Again, United States is impeccably a secure country when it comes to geography. I can confidently tell you that no other nation has such a secure geography than the United States. If you take a look at the map again, right in the middle where you see the states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, stretching down all the way to Texas. That line separating the American East from the American West is known as the 100th meridian. Left to that map, towards California, to the Pacific Ocean, that area is known as the Great American Desert. So essentially the colonists, the settlers, conquered the entire map, conquered the entire West Coast to become a maritime nation. This being said, the United States cannot be a continental power without being a maritime power first. Let me reiterate this one more time. When it comes to geography, the United States is the most secure country in the world. Again, take a look at the map. What do you have? You have Canada in the north, an incredibly secure country, populated with middle-class Canadians, And down you have state of Mexico, again, militarily a weak country that has never really posed a significant threat to the United States. True, Mexico today is a narco state. We all know that. There is a problem with crime. There is a problem with drug trafficking. But as a geopolitical actor, Mexico has never posed a significant threat. So this is given the United States an immense chance to focus on itself during the early days of Republic, to expand peacefully, to expand without any serious challenges, and essentially close the entire map, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And again, part of the reason is because the United States has never had any serious neighbors to pose any significant military challenge to it. Let me go to the second slide. So again, I'm skipping lots of events, but this is an event that you guys should know. So the United States became a global power after the US-Spanish War back in 1898. This is when the United States established a regional hegemony, meaning it became the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. And always remember, no country can become a global power without dominating its own region first. So when it comes to American dominance of the Western Hemisphere, Spanish-American War was key. It was all about pushing the Spanish Empire out of the Western Hemisphere. It was all about preventing the European powers from intervening in the business of American states. So again, President Roosevelt, the gentleman, you can see the first photo next to the American flag. He was a progressive, and this is when domestically the progressive movement began in America, which to an extent stretched all the way to its foreign policy. So it was absolutely imperative that the Americans kicked out the Spanish out of the Western Hemisphere so they could establish regional hegemony. So what happened? After the Spanish War, Spain gave up its possessions in the Western Hemisphere. The United States gained Puerto Rico, it gained Guam, it liberated Cuba, and essentially became the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, which in turn gave the United States to expand forward to affect the balance of power in Eurasia. Another gentleman that you guys should know about, one of the first scholars who advocated for this concept of America becoming a global power, that was Alfred Mahan. He's the father of American maritime strategy. He was a big advocate of maritime power. And this is when Roosevelt, President Teddy Roosevelt, embarks on a massive naval buildup, building world-class ships, building a maritime power, and projecting power throughout the globe. Again, the United States became a global power right after the American-Spanish War, after the Treaty of Paris was concluded in 1898. Let me reiterate this one more time. No nation can dominate globally without dominating its region first. And there's only one regional hegemon in the world, and that is the United States. No other nation, no other country is effectively dominating its own surroundings the way the United States is dominating the Western Hemisphere. And by dominating the Western Hemisphere, the United States can focus its military and economic power on Eurasia peripheries, concentrate its military forces over there to affect the balance of power. Let's move on. So again, skipping lots of events, including World War I. What do we mean when we say Pax Americana, an American-led order, rules-based order, or liberal order, call you what you want? So after the Second World War, the United States exited the war as an incredibly powerful nation. It produced 50% of global output. The Soviet Union was still recovering from the losses of the war. Europe was down on its knees. Asia was in ruins. And since all the wars occurred in Eurasia, far away in the Pacific, again, you can see how useful geography has been to the United States. The US was able to mobilize its economic and industrial base to affect the balance of power and enter the world wars. But again, after World War, the United States exited the war as an incredibly powerful nation. And it used its military power, its economic power to construct what we call today as, again, rules-based international order. During the first photo, the black and white photo, this is the Treaty of San Francisco. This is one of the most consequential treaties that the United States has signed. Essentially, it created the Asian hub and spoke system, meaning the United States effectively occupied Japan and created the defense bilateral relations with Australia, with Thailand, with Philippines, with South Korea. This is a type of a system that exists till today. The state of Hawaii, which looks towards Asia, looks towards Japan, looks towards Hawaii, it is the hub. And these states basically rotate around the state of Hawaii. I'll show you the map right after this slide. Obviously, the creation of the United Nations and other multilateral institutions. Again, the United States mobilized its power. It realized that if it leaves Europe like it did after World War I, chances were that there was going to be another war, another conflict. So till today, the United States is very much embedded in Europe. You have the Ramstein base in Germany, you have bases in Britain, you have bases in Italy. So there are military bases scattered throughout Europe. And this is part of the Pax Americana world order that the United States created in the aftermath of Second World War. Again, then you have NATO, signed in 1950. This brought much of Europe under American security umbrella. The two key states that basically gave the Americans the idea that we need some sort of security lines, because they realized that the Cold War with the Soviet Union was going to be a very long one. Remember, Greece and Turkey, two important states that basically embarked the initiation of NATO. Finally, you have the United States Recovery Program for Europe, otherwise known as Marshall Plan. This was a program with $1945, about $13 billion American taxpayers sent to Europe to reconstruct Europe. It had two aspects, essentially. First of all, being a humanitarian aid. Europe was on its knee. They were recovering after World War II. And second, because of the looming Cold War, national security threat. Americans realized that if they don't step up, if they don't get involved in Europe, Soviet Union would. So it was imperative that Americans took the first step. And they effectively isolated Europe from Cold War, essentially, drew a line between Europe and North Africa, and of course, initiated the whole strategy of containment, basically preventing the Soviet Union from further marching into Europe and keeping the Soviet Union landlocked. This was the entire rationale behind the Cold War, to keep the Soviet Union landlocked, to prevent Soviet Union from entering the global seas, to prevent Soviet Union from further marching and expanding towards Western Europe. The next slide just wanted to show you what the hub and spoke Asian system looks like that the United States constructed after the World War. Right in the middle, where you can see the state of Hawaii highlighted in yellow. That's another American state. It's basically the hub of this Asian alliance system, and it looks towards Japan, looks towards South Korea, looks towards Philippines and Australia. And the whole idea is that these states basically rotate around the state of Hawaii. The Pacific Fleet is headquartered in Hawaii, so the United States conducts numerous naval patrols in this area to make sure that it's staying true to the defense treaties it signed during the San Francisco Treaty. And you can see how far the continental United States is, with Washington, D.C. being totally on the opposite coast on Atlantic. So again, state of Hawaii, although it's a state, it has lots of autonomy, and in many points can actually act as its own country. All right, so the rise of the national security apparatus. Let me just briefly talk about this. I won't go into details, just give you a brief idea. As the United States was expanding globally in the aftermath of the Second World War, there were lots of domestic changes as well in terms of reorganizing the entire military and intelligence organizations in the United States. When it became clear that the Soviet Union and United States would be locked in a long, protracted Cold War, it became imperative that the US enacted some domestic changes to meet the demands of the looming Cold War. So in 1947, President Truman signs the National Security Act of 1947, otherwise known as NSA 1947. And the first picture you can see Truman signing it with his administration people behind him. And this created several important agencies and reorganized the military in a way that is very relevant today. So first and foremost, it created the National Security Council. I'm pretty sure most of you have heard about Bolton, about Kissinger, about Brent Scowcroft. These people were all national security secretaries. But the original creator of this executive agency was President Truman. And National Security Council is essentially created to advise the president on pressing national security issues. Being war preparation, being the pandemic coronavirus, for God's sake, be it some domestic terrorism, be it any international crisis. The first thing that the president does, he goes to his National Security Council, primarily consisting by the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Homeland Security, the CIA Director, and Secretary of State. And National Security Council itself is a very flexible organization. It is totally up to the president to determine the size of it, the way it operates, and what agenda will be discussed. So it's not a fixed standard format. All presidents have had their own National Security Councils. For instance, during President Eisenhower's presidency, National Security Council operated as a military organization in a way that it was very disciplined, periodic debates, periodic meetings. And then you had Kissinger when he was the National Security Council. This was when the National Security Council was expanded up to 500 to 600 people. Again, it's up to the president to determine what kind of National Security Council he or she wants. Another important thing was the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, otherwise known as the CIA. Lots of stuff has been written about the reasons that CIA was created. I won't go into details. Again, just give you two reasons that are generally accepted as the main reasons for the CIA. So after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, later on it became American policymakers came to believe that part of the reason that the Americans did not predict that there was such a coming attack was because the intelligence was not centralized, meaning different intelligence agencies kind of knew about it, but failed to coordinate the information and give it to the president so he could act. So Central Intelligence Agency was actually created to centralize intelligence, meaning collect intelligence from everyone else, put it in a nice brief and give it to the president. And of course, the other reason was bringing covert secret operations under civilian control. Before that, American military was basically in charge of the covert operations, secret operations. So American policymakers wanted to make sure that they have a say in the secret operation. Hence the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, which, as you know, obviously it is still around and was basically a very important tool during the Cold War political warfare realm. All right, so next up is the post-Cold War. Again, I'm skipping the entire Cold War strategy. So after the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States went on a strategic vacation. The budget of the military was cut, the budget of the intelligence services was cut, and generally whenever there is a massive conflict that comes to an end, there is a demand from the people to scale back military spending and focus on domestic issues. And this is exactly what happened during the 90s, to a point where President George Bush Sr. lost its election because people realized that he was not interested in domestic issues. The entire slogan of Bush, Bill Clinton presidential debate was, "It's the economy, stupid." So Bill Clinton essentially was pushing an economic agenda that we need to focus on our issues, while George Bush Sr. was still seen as someone who's deeply interested in foreign affairs. And for an average American who paid so much during the Cold War, bankrolled the entire military, they believed that it was time to focus on domestic issues. And after the Cold War, there was this sense in America that the United States was unwinnable. essentially that the history of the world came to an end. Pretty sure most of you have heard about Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History. So there was a sense that this is it. There's not going to be any more conflicts. We've won the war. We've won the Nazis. We won the Cold War. This is it. We can scale back and focus domestically and not mess with the rest of the world. In the aftermath of the Cold War, another mini conflict occurred, the First Persian Gulf. And the United States, basically, the whole point was to go in, push the Iraqis out of Kuwait, and come back. And this turned out to be a massive success. It was a successful operation. The US demonstrated its capabilities of precision strike, military mobilization, logistics. So this added another layer of confidence that America has got it right. No one's going to mess with the United States. So the lesson was really hard. In 2011, as you can see in the second photo, there was an attack on American mainland, the 9/11 attacks, which essentially changed the entire mindset of the United States. Many blamed the previous administrations for taking the world so much easier. That's it. We don't have to do anything else. We don't need the military expenditure. We don't need to spend much on intelligence. And many point out at 9/11 saying this is the result of the strategic vacation that you guys took in the immediate aftermath of Cold War. So the 9/11 changed the entire way the American foreign policy operated. For the next decade, 2 decades, the United States ignored the rest of the world in significant ways to focus on terrorism. The first entity to go to Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks was the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. It was not the Pentagon, it was not the Special Forces, it was the CIA. The CIA goes into Afghanistan to basically create a coalition against Taliban. They paid the Northern Alliance and other anti-Taliban groups, and they toppled it. So this created a competition between the United States Department of Defense and the CIA. The Secretary of Defense at the time, Don Rumsfeld, he became curious as to why a military operation should be conducted by the Central Intelligence and not the Pentagon. So he created special forces in the bureaucracy, deep bureaucracies of the Pentagon to basically take over the Afghanistan war. And as you can see, till today, it's the longest war in American history. We're still stuck in Afghanistan. And there are some steps President Trump is taking to pull the troops out because essentially this is one of those wars when the United States failed to transform military victory into a political victory. And as you know, war itself is not the end. War is political, meaning whenever you win a war, you have to transform it into a political victory. You have to have political objectives. Otherwise, war gives you just dead people. And that's not what you want. You have to be able to transform your military victory into political victory. So, as I said, 9/11 stretches down the United States into a long conflict with terrorism. The entire military doctrine changes. Foreign policy concentration changes. Till 2017. And let me go to the next slide. So in 2017, the Trump administration signed the National Security Strategy. And let me just briefly give you an idea of what National Security Strategy is. So the first time Americans began letting the public know what the National Security Strategy is vis-a-vis certain threat was during the Cold War. If you Google Mr. X containment strategy, that's the strategy that George Kennan wrote in 1945. He was a diplomat stationed in Moscow. He basically let the public know that this is what we need to do in order to contain the Soviet Union expansionism. And since then, basically almost all administrations have conducted some sort of national security strategy to set the goals, strategy, and objectives of American foreign policy. Henry Kissinger, most of you have heard about him. Henry Kissinger was really big at writing national security strategies, and he would give so many details that the Soviets thought that this could be disinformation, because why would someone give so much details about their national security strategy. But in reality, in fact, he was an academic who happened to be working for the government. So he liked writing a lot. So in 2017, the United States issued its national security strategy, calling the return of great power competition. This is the first time that the United States talks about about great power politics since the end of the Cold War. Americans thought that for a very long time there is not going to be any nation, a nation state, to be able to fully challenge the power of the United States. So, as we know, we're entering a Cold War 2.0 with China. So, United States and China are at war. Forget about what they're telling you on TV. Forget about what CNN tells you. Forget about what BBC tells you. The United States and China are in Cold War, and this is going to be a much longer, much difficult, much complex, much protracted Cold War than that of the Soviet Union and the United States. So what went wrong with China? Why am I saying this? Because for the next decades or so, and if you're a student of international affairs, you'll be studying this a lot. For the next decades, US-China relations is going to be the most dominating topic of the international affairs. Right now, there is a massive shift, massive escalation, massive focus here in the United States on China. This is going to be a long conflict, and the United States is coming back to great power politics tradition, meaning there is going to be a massive revision in foreign policy principles. There is going to be a massive revision in military doctrine, intelligence doctrine, and the way the country perceives the outer world. So, what Americans did with China. So there was a feeling in the United States in early 70s that if you liberate a certain country economically, the result would be a political freedom as well. Harvard scholar Samuel Huntington was basically the originator of this theory that if you enrich a certain country, there will be a rising middle class, and that middle class will eventually demand political freedoms. It was true about Japan, it was true about Germany, it was true about South Korea, and a bunch of other countries. Don't forget, before becoming Japan today, Japan was an imperial power, a very impressive one with a difficult history of colonial oppression. But in the aftermath of the Second World War, the American economic investment and rehabilitation of Japan showed that if you enrich a certain country economically, the result will be a democracy. And Americans thought that this would work with China as well. So in 1970, as you know, when Kissinger, along with Nixon, went to China to open China, the whole concept was basically connect China to international economy. So China can have a booming middle class. And maybe one day there'll be another Asian democracy. Another reason was, of course, to balance against the Soviet Union. But it did not work the way Americans planned. And from early 2000s, it was becoming clear that China has different plans. There have been several military conflicts on a local level. There have been several clashes. There have been intellectual property thefts. And China essentially has let the United States know that it has its own plans. And remember when I told you in the beginning that the United States first dominated its own region, then expanded globally to dominate the Eurasian peripheries. So Americans have learned the lesson really well. If United States can do it, so can others can do it. So it doesn't matter who the president is, doesn't matter who the Congress is dominated by, doesn't matter what the bureaucracy looks like. The golden principle of American foreign policy is to not let any country to dominate its region, because they know if a certain country dominates its region, they will eventually expand, mobilize their economic and industrial base, turn it into a military power, and expand all the way to the Western Hemisphere. Exactly the same way the United States did. It mobilized its power in the Western Hemisphere. It saw no competitors, was able to focus its military power in Eurasia. So again, the number one principle of American foreign policy, do not let any country to dominate its region. And it showed that whenever there is a potential regional hegemon, the United States is willing to go to war. I'm not saying that this is always going to be the case, but history proves these claims that Americans are willing to go to war. First time Imperial Germany wanted to dominate continental Europe. The United States went to war. Second time, Nazi Germany wanted to dominate the continental Europe. The United States went to war. Soviet Union wanted to dominate the Eurasia continent. The result was Cold War. Japan wanted to dominate the Asia Pacific. It had its own strategy known as East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, meaning Japan wanted to dominate Asia. If Japan dominated Asia, the next would be Hawaii, coast of California, coast of Alaska. So the result was the United States went to war against Japan. And there was a study done in Harvard a few years ago, essentially looking at what is called Thucydides Trap. What is Thucydides Trap? The whole concept is whenever you have an established power and you have a rising power, the result is usually a war. Because when a rising power gets up to challenge the power of an existing state, the state that already possesses the most power does not tolerate a peer competitor. Out of 25 cases, in 18 cases, the result was war. Going back to Athens and Sparta, First World War between British Empire and Imperial Germany. And don't forget, Britain and Germany, Imperial Germany, were economically basically connected the way as China and United States were economically connected. But that did not stop them to go to war because Britain saw Imperial Germany as a rising peer competitor. And the result was obviously a clash. So the question of the 21st century, if you will, is whether United States, the established power, and China, the rising power, will be able to avoid the Thucydides trap. Will the result be a type of Cold War that the United States entered with the Soviet Union? Will there be a military clash? We don't know yet, but things do not look good, I'll tell you that. Another important thing you have to know about China is that for the first time in 500 years, China feels confident enough on the mainland as to project power towards South China Sea, which connects the Indian Ocean, one of the most important oceans, eventually building a navy, building military power to push the United States out of the Western Pacific, out of its peripheries. The United States, let me actually go to the next.
I'm sorry, Eric, I have to interrupt you here. Actually, as far as I understood, though we bought full version of Zoom, unfortunately, I guess there is technical problem and the session is going to be interrupted. So let me interrupt it here and dear students, let's join the session once again. I'm sorry for this technical problem.